Just give a few moments for the audience to come in before we start. Sharmila, you have a hi from Rashmi Verma.
Oh, I'm saying a hi back.
So we'll start with an introduction. My name is Diana and I'm head marketing at MRSI. Welcome to today's masterclass, where we explore the world of digital ethnography and its large application across various domains and research audiences. In this session, you will receive an orientation to how digital ethnography is pushing boundaries, offering fresh insights into the ways audiences live, survive, and thrive in digital ecosystems. I'm especially thrilled to introduce our speakers from Purple Audacity, none than Sharmila Das, the founder and chairwoman, who has always been at the forefront of cultural insights and innovation, and Nandita Singh, who is the vice president and culture engine, who is also part of managing committee of MRSI. I can confidently say you are in for an engaging and enriching session. Our speakers' passion and depth of knowledge is truly inspirational, and I know they will leave us all thinking differently. We aim to create an interactive session where you will be able to ask your questions. And in case you prefer to write your question, there is a special box for the questions as well. Feel free to drop your inquiry at any time during the session, and we aim to answer all or at least as many as possible whenever we have the Q&A part. So sit back, engage, and let's explore how digital ethnography can expand the prospects of research. Nandita and Sharmila, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, for this absolutely, wonderful introduction. You are too kind, and both of us are very excited to be sharing our experience so far with this particular, which is, digital ethnography. So. It is just 1 hour that we have got, and we are mindful of that. But we will try to share the, width and depth of our experiences and our understanding, which have led to certain systems that we have created on digital ethnography. So, Nandita, should we start?
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope the audio and video is working well. Just going to move on, and Dan, if you can let me know that. Before we start, though, I do want to take a second to check in, and while we can't hear you, maybe ask if you've all had a chance to have a glass of water, maybe get some caffeine, and if not, you could use the next couple of minutes to maybe do that, and so we can get into a relaxing start. I also want to say thank you to everyone who wrote back. We sent out a little questionnaire very close to our session today. And we did hear back, and there were some interesting perspectives from all of you who are attending. And so we will start off with that as our beginning to this masterclass, which is the understanding that we wanted to sort of know if you have interacted with the idea of digital ethnography before, if you have experienced it in any way, and what really you make of it in terms of who it's meant for, because those are some of the questions we're looking to also answer today. And what we've learned from all of you is that we may not all be on the same page when we talk about what digital ethnography means to us. How do we go about approaching it, the definition of it in terms of the universe, the spaces, and several other things that we'll be touching upon in just a minute. And how do I utilize it? I think that was a key question that emerged, which is in a real world context, if I'm a practitioner, even if it is in an academic context, how do I actually utilize it, as opposed to feeling like it's this open, very undefined space where I don't really know how to focus myself. And that's something that we'll be touching upon as well. What we do want to set context with is that this session is going to look to consolidate this perspective, and this is based very much on practitioners' experience. So you may at certain points see us departing from theory. And the idea is that hopefully by the end of this, there is some motivation and inspiration for you to try your hand at some of the tips that we provide or some of the cases that we share with you, or those contexts. Very quickly, to talk about what is on the menu today, we are looking to talk about reframing tradition, and by that we mean we're looking at really getting a sense of what is different, because ethnography as a term, of course, much predates digital ethno, as we call it, and there are certain redefinitions that we want to talk about, and then we get into the possibilities, the cases that we'd like to share with you in terms of examples of application that we didn't think would be as effective as they turned out to be, and then a few tips and tricks, hopefully, that you can incorporate into whenever you undertake your next endeavor with digital ethno. And then we'll come, of course, to...
Just checking with Diana also, is the slide visible? Because it is not visible on my screen.
No, not yet. Nandita, please share.
Okay. Right. Just give me one moment. Is it back now?
Yes.
Yes. All right.
We have it now.
Yeah.
Yes. So, yes, Nandita has already, given the menu for these, few minutes that we have with all of you. So let me just get into the origin thought, and that might be one of the very few pieces of theory that we are going to share with you today. So if we can move to the next slide, Nandita. Yeah. Ethno. Let's start with ethno because that is the genesis of digital ethno, right? A word which comes from the Greek word ethnikos. What does it mean? It is about a deeper, a very real-time understanding, and specific focus is on getting this understanding in the natural setting of the participant. So therefore, ethnography and its origin in sociology had started with understanding cultures, right? And therefore, all cultures have certain very overt, very explicit kind of, uh, parameters or elements or situations or symbols or rituals that are very salient. So yes, one should focus on that. But at the same time, the covert, the tacit dimensions, which are probably difficult to articulate but are equally important if you are trying to understand a culture which is leading to certain perceptions, which will lead to behavior, and which has an impact on the business that you are in, then that move needs to be understood in a very descriptive and a very interpretive kind of a manner. So therefore, words, expressions, images, everything comes together when you are trying to use ethnography as a tool. Where does it land? It actually lands at drawing a complete picture of the people you were trying to study. Now, if people are evolving, their lives are evolving, what they use is evolving, and digital use is something which is, today's the kids who are born, by the time they are not even crawling, they become aware of buttons on the mobile phones of their parents. So therefore, if that is so, then it is very, logical that ethnography will actually adapt digital techniques, digital technology, and it will therefore become something which we are referring to as digital ethno. The pandemic, the lockdown, the unprecedented stress that everybody went through does, have a very great impact on the rapid, accelerated evolution that we are seeing of digital ethno. But that is not the beginning, actually. So I can actually remember studies that we have done in 2009, 2010 with audiences or cultures which one would actually, feel a little skeptical about using digital ethno with. But we were doing a study with the understanding the aspirations of the bottom of pyramid, cohorts in smaller towns, in semi-rural kind of areas, and all the pictures that you are seeing here are clicked by the participants of that study. Who were the participants? Farmers, rickshaw pullers, the kelewala, the woman who goes to a factory and works there, all of them, and the homemakers also in the rural setting. The very obvious aspirations which you are seeing pictures of were about mobile phone, maybe a dish TV, a television set, maybe a smart television set or a flat television set, maybe just electricity, having that at home, or a gas chulha. But there were unexpected pictures that we got. Aspiration is about having my own borewell. Aspiration is not about only having a roof on my head. It is about having an asbestos roof on my head. It is about, getting my daughter educated. Maybe then she will work in a factory and not, under the sun, sweating and in the field. Aspiration is having a better designed kind of a space at home. Aspiration is becoming a part of self-help groups, which will empower me further. So therefore, a lot of things which probably would not have been articulated came through the kind of, pictures, the self-generated content that our participants shared with us.
Going to quickly
Yeah,
cut
yeah.
in here and talk about fast forward
Yeah.
to the year 2020,
Absolutely.
and you'll see this generational back and forth between Sharmila and myself. Cut to the year 2020, something everybody here is familiar with, and we found that the appetite to be able to share stories is something that has significantly increased when we heard stories of resilience and of even the mundane through the lockdown, depending on the experiences that people had. And of course, one would have thought that it is a time of immense difficulty, but there were so many stories from all over the country that in a larger effort that we made throughout maybe the first part of 2020, where we heard stories throughout the entire period. It wasn't just certain spaces when things were all right, it was also wanting to share stories in times of distress. Now, the reason you don't see the representative images here is because it was a sensitive time. And so we've tried to give you an essence of what kind of stories came through. But this very much was in a position where we could not have possibly met them in person. This was the outcome of a digital ethnographic approach to understanding people. Okay. Right.
Another small bit of theory again, and this is what Professor Adil Gold had actually given to sociology, and all ethnography, followers, practitioners deeply follow this, typology of what the researcher can be in an ethnography study. So therefore, it goes from, being complete participant to complete observer. So a researcher can actually, and you would have, read about sociologists who have gone and lived with communities for years as complete participants to arrive at a full understanding of their culture. And complete observer is that researcher is not really participating. There is a sense of detachment. You are actually looking at the community and their culture from a little distance. Okay, and then there are the other variants of participant as observer or observer as participant. So involvement and detachment. These were the two parameters on which the entire trajectory was placed. But that is for oldies like me, the new researchers on the block, the new ethnographers on the block have actually evolved this entire sense of digital ethnography to another level altogether. So, Nandita, who is the observer now and who is the participant?
I think while there are several definitions of the degree of involvement and interaction, I think the big part that comes into this equation is what digital does for people and how it enables them to, and when I say people, I mean participants, to interact with the individual who's making the observation. And this is a question that comes up often in terms of, if digital is a platform that is virtual in nature, then is there space for me to really understand the person? I think that is where we depart a little bit from a very anthropological understanding of what digital ethnography entails, which is also something that has a lot of questions around it. But the few things that we touch upon when we look at the availability of digital as a platform to be able to explore, to learn, to interact, to express myself, we look at a few elements of that interaction. First, the question that comes up, and you'll see us summarize this again, is where do I start? How do I observe? What does observation even entail, short of seeming like invasion of privacy? And how do I gather information? I'm departing from a Q&A format, and if the platform is seemingly impersonal, then where do I go from there? And how do I get authentic voices? I know this was a question that also came up from the questionnaire that we had sent out, which was, how do I know that this is real? And so we do try and address that as we move forward, but I think what we want to emphasize is reimagining the role of the participant, because inherently we will now begin to encounter people and have encountered people who are present on the platform, who use the platform, if not to speak up, then to explore, to learn, to interact with the world. We are looking at the participant as the investigator come storyteller, which is essentially about handing over the mic. And that is a big part of what we focus on today, beyond the nitty-gritties of what methods and what tactics. And that brings us to then what are we really talking about within the realm of this participant as a storyteller come investigator? We're going to touch upon how the three elements that you see on the screen, which is agility, mindfulness, and iteration, how these three come together to ensure that participants comfortably get the space to grab the mic or the camera or the keyboard, whatever it may be, to be able to really understand experiences. One of the other things we also touch upon would be, who are these people? Because that is a key question everyone is looking to answer. Is it, as many of you said, the young Gen Z, and I'm only quoting, this is no bias of mine, but the young Gen Z, technologically enabled and savvy individual.
You mean the younger generation? Younger.
I am only quoting responses from our audience today, and there is no bias involved, as there mustn't be for a researcher. But it is just the practitioner's experience, and we wanted to share some of these learnings with you. And these are the things that we're going to try and cover as we move along. And this credit is, of course, not just to the two practitioners sitting here, but the teams and groups that we've worked with to arrive at this knowledge and intelligence. But we're going to start with the simple question of, so who do I do this particular exercise with? Whom do I undertake this digital ethnography with? Yes, there will be a certain limitation in terms of being able to reach maybe specific audiences who may not have any interaction, but as Sharmila mentioned in her first example, when we use the tool of phone and gave that to a set of participants who may not have a lot of experience with technology, even they were empowered to be able to tell the story of their aspirations. And so we wanted to start with just expanding the understanding of whom can I use this particular method with, and how am I defining this method even. Very quickly talking about, and these are all representative images I would like to just reiterate. Ordinarily, maybe my eye line would have gone bottom left and said, okay, that's my participant for digital ethnography. But the understanding is that it's not just about the person's story and how they are interacting. Say, an idea of interacting with a digitally savvy individual would be on social media platforms. Sure enough, but we tend to limit that understanding as well to be restricted to, say, people who are part of communities actively. But have you thought about what insights you could get on the goings on at a wedding if we were to think of digital ethnography? Could we potentially understand the risk that somebody at a high risk job undergoes if we utilize digital ethnography and give them the space to maybe not be present immediately, but give them the space to tell us what those experiences look like? Could we capture the experiences of age? A very prominent conversation these days about whom digital ethnography can reach out to includes the part about what is the age cutoff. And we do think that that is something that is slowly expanding. The degree of comfort may be different, and that pretty much is where the researcher's role comes in, where you may not be physically present while they're telling their story if they captured it in a video, but can you enable the participant to leverage this method just as much as you are? Then we come to the point of spaces. Now, what is the site? Because when it's fieldwork offline, we go and meet people, or at most, if it's a virtual interview, then there's an individual seated in a certain physical space and we're interacting on a video conferencing platform. But what do I really count as spaces? We picked up some individual situation. And this was a challenge that we had posed earlier on to a smaller audience as well, which was to say, do you think that these situations could be captured using digital ethnography, which is, could I understand nuances related to whatever interactions and whatever you make of them on the screen? And the understanding was fairly simple, that the nature of sharing and the kind of expression that people take on, it's pretty much like everyday life, right? You play different roles in different digital spaces that you occupy. And so could we expand this definition of digital to actually have different sites and have a clearer understanding of which site serves what purpose? Could we be thinking about one-on-one interactions where I could elicit a different kind of expression or sharing from an individual, where we are giving or offering this sort of space for an individual to be able to tell their story to the extent that they're comfortable, versus the public, right? And that's what you see. There is a passive space where I could just be present in a digital space and be able to observe, but then there is a primary space within either a social setting where I'm interacting with an individual within a community, or one-on-one, like I just said. And could we also think a little bit about, therefore, what the utility of that interaction would look like? The point is to say that the more we nuance it and the more we experience using digital ethnography for different subject matters, there is greater scope for us to be able to understand that the quality, the nature, the depth of response that we get might also take on different forms. And maybe we don't lump it into just one single method and it has to be utilized in a singular manner. It could very well serve the context of the study that you're undertaking.
I just wanted to, come in at this point, Nandita, because the three words that you had shared, agility, mindfulness, and iteration. If you look at it, then whatever we have said so far about who are these participants who could actually, participate in a digital ethnography project, what are these spaces where we can actually think about utilizing certain tools? What kind of studies are possible. You would actually realize why we are focusing so much on agility, mindfulness, and iteration, because there is no standardized formula which exists. Why? Because people are different, and if people are different, if their experiences, their familiarity, their comfort levels are different, then the researcher has got to be mindful. In 2020, we had talked about woke qualitative. Now woke is the closest word we could think of, which actually expresses empathy, mindfulness, and a very, very conscious attempt to make things easy for the participant so that they can actually, provide you with the inputs. Okay.
Well, we're not going to go through each of these cases because we'll try and come back to specific examples. I would urge you to take a quick look, maybe jot down some points or questions that come to your mind, because this is the point usually where I do find that there are questions in terms of how best to utilize the method or methods plural. But we'll move on and we'll probably cover these again once when we come back to the specific cases. But before we move on to the cases or the stories, we'd like to tell you about how digital ethnography has itself proven to be something that is much more versatile than one would imagine to begin with. So many stories, right? One of the things that one wonders is if I'm in a digital space, if I'm passively observing or I'm having an interaction, just the volume of content and information that you may get that you have to filter through can be overwhelming, because this isn't a structured questionnaire necessarily. It could just be an act of observation. So here, there is the additional step wherein you get to, and you can give yourself the opportunity to go back to the participant, share what you've learned, what you've assimilated or what you've picked up, and ask if you've understood their perspective. And that's where the iteration comes in, which is, it doesn't have to be a linear journey from starting digital ethno to ending digital ethno. We could think about how it complements various other methods. And because we are talking about a practitioner's world, and we do need to be practical in that we need to ensure that what we've got is adequate, it's representative, it is authentic. One would also urge whoever is here, and maybe the people that you perhaps collaborate with as well, to think of how we can use it as maybe one of the methods. And is there a very specific purpose that this particular approach can serve? We have found that complementing methods and being able to have a brief conversation or an informal catch up with our participants, if that is the nature of the research that we're undertaking, does help to corroborate. In fact, if anything, it will get built upon, and which really maximizes the value of those interactions as well. Not to mention that if we've had longitudinal interaction with an individual or with several people, there does tend to be some comfort which is compounded over a period of time. It actually gives us better access without being intrusive, without necessarily making the participant uncomfortable. Okay, with that, and I'm mindful of time, we'll try to keep some time for questions towards the end. We'll get into a few cases, and the idea of picking and choosing these cases of the several that we've had experiences with in the past was to say that the purpose that we serve with digital ethnography as an approach can be vastly different. It can serve a different purpose for the brand or the entity that you're conducting research for. It can serve a different purpose for the participants and the profile of participants and how they are able to interact with you. And of course, it can answer a variety of questions. So we're going to go through these very quickly.
Yeah.
Very sort of upfront and top of mind when we ask people, what does digital ethnography mean to you? Very often it will be about the observation of digital behaviors, because it kind of follows and goes hand in hand to say digital ethnography for digital behaviors. We will perhaps go beyond that in a moment, but this would be the first sort of example that we have where we are attempting to understand not just how an individual interacts with digital, but the behaviors or the perceptions that are linked to all of the stimulus that is thrown at us. Also something one would see in perhaps the adjacent stream of UI UX as well, but this is more about how the technology interface impacts my real world behavior. So what are the semiotics of value what am I looking at or paying attention to when all of this, and we are very much upon sales season, uh, uh, and what is the kind of input that I'm responding to? And this is not something that happens over a day, and we know that really well. So a long-term understanding of what works for me and being able to capture it in real time. I think that element of being engaged with anyone who has access to a smartphone, anyone who makes a purchase during a festive season, is something that we've seen add value to our understanding of this entire sort of very large period where sales happen. Another example, now this moves very quickly from you telling me that this is something that I responded to today, or this is an ad or a banner that I really liked, moving from that very rapidly to being able to tell my story with comfort, perhaps from a place that is not very close to where the researcher is based, and maybe something that I would not be able to capture even if I was sitting across from you one-on-one. So you find a target group that is newly or recently acquainted with the idea of video calling. And this is something that has definitely taken off substantially post COVID, but just the understanding that video and voice were media that were being better utilized by those who had perhaps joined the digital journey not very early on or were not early adopters. We actually have had experiences where we've been wonderfully delighted with how comprehensively certain participants have told us stories about a category you would never think of sort of involving within the realms of digital ethnography. The component of self-reporting or telling my own story brings in a completely different flavor to the conversation or the engagement and the ability to really share one's experiences.
And don't forget the role that TikTok, sorry,
Instagram is great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Reels have played.
Reels
Yes.
have played.
Yeah, which incidentally gets referred to as TikTok by a lot of participants still. But yeah, definitely short format videos have created this sort of inspiration and encouragement to say there's some familiarity with what that output can look like. And so we've actually found that participants that you think may be daunted by the idea of putting themselves out there, in some cases that may not be entirely true, because there is this inundation of digital content on the regular. Then comes the role of your participant as a creator. We have in the past, and of course we've attempted to de-identify, as we have in the past as well, the content that you see on the screen, but we have been able to leverage just the desire to tell stories and be creative online. One of the things about digital adoption has been the fact that one of the things to learn about digital adoption rather is that it usually is a learning curve, in that you go from being a passive consumer to playing a more active role in contributing to social networking, to be able to contribute to your own social media. It could be, video platforms. But we've also had participants tell us creative stories, utilize that little, the spark that you have when you want to share an opinion on something which has maybe nothing to do with your individual experiences, but actually telling creative stories that have eventually led us to building stories for brands, with of course the understanding that there is a brand and a product in question. And again, then this becomes a little bit more synthesized, a little bit more framed and articulated, but it is still leveraging the power of the digital medium to enable people to tell stories in their own words, rather than sitting in a Q&A setting. That is not to undermine the latter, of course, but it very much comes from a place of encouraging creativity. And you see participants involving their social environment, the places they visit, in telling these stories about a product that you have given to them. And then, of course, there is understanding digital preferences, which is much more observational in nature. Here, we actually had a component of trying to be present, at least with our participants, in terms of understanding how they utilize life. So we had interacted with our participants and told them to let us know when they get a notification and they join a live event to see what's happening. And this was truly being able to be present while also giving participants a space to be present in their own sort of sites or locations, as we've been calling them, and getting a sense of what those interactions really look like. So these are the few cases that we had. There were a couple of more examples where we wanted to, of course, we want to be able to share as much as we can, but there is definitely paucity of time. But we did want to share that it's also not limited to topic. It's not just product and brand, and while that very much constitutes the work that we do, it's about also sentiment. It's also just being able to longitudinally engage with the participants that you're interacting with in a digital space, where they have the ability to detach from you, come back and share their sentiment. We've done it around topics which you ordinarily might feel a little uncomfortable having conversations around, even talking about sentiments towards a subject like migration, which comes with a lot of heaviness and context. Being able to talk about things like trust when it comes to sources of information and who are reliable personalities. All of these conversations that would have otherwise been a little bit marred by discomfort also are conversations that can be had in this space, where I get the freedom to step back and not necessarily be face to face with you when I share this sentiment. And of course, there's a number of tools that one could utilize.
Nandita,
Yeah.
I think this is the point where we should also take the question that Krishnan Subramaniam has posed. The question is, how do we ensure both width and depth of participation? And it's an excellent question, Krishnan, because this is something which we were also very worried about during the initial stages. See, in ethnography also, you will see that when you speak about tools of ethnography, they range from pure observation to interactions, which could be in-depth interviews, or which could be group discussions, or it could be, PRA, the participatory rural appraisal, which is actually just, being there and walking and speaking and observing, all of it getting done in tandem. A physical ethnography session, you can do all of that to ensure width and depth of participation. In digital ethnography, how will you do that? We adapted from the tools, and therefore it doesn't mean that the researchers become completely absent when digital ethnography is happening. There are interactions, there are, certain, I would like to understand what you have shared with me a little more. So can you just talk about it? There are nudges which happen that you are not, you have just given answers in very short kind of videos or pictures. Can you just, give me a story on that? So therefore, the researcher is not absent, and that's why the width and depth both can get ensured. Over to you, Nandita.
Absolutely. And I think a little bit of a conversation about the tools that we were referring to will help visualize this, because I am sure that there are questions around how do you ask these questions and where do you ask them, and how do you frame questions that people may not want to necessarily answer directly, or may not even have necessarily the ability to answer directly. Which brought us to, and please pardon the use of very basic pop culture reference, but it happens when you hear repeatedly about a method, and you do understand that there may be general applicability, but the question is why should I even look at this, and why not just follow the methods that I have been following so far? They work very well. And I think that is very much, and this is our submission to everyone, in terms of how digital ethnography can add a dimension to the kind of interaction you're having. It is a world where that is, and this is the cliche as I'm going to be in this entire session, but it is pretty much an extension of who we are. And so factoring in that reality, or maybe not factoring it in, could mean that you're missing out on a true portrayal or a true sentiment from the individuals that you're interacting with, because they live a big part of their lives in these spaces. Few advantages that we've found, at least in terms of how it complements the other methods that we use, is the fact that it doesn't lock the individual into time and space and say, this is where you tell me everything that you need to share. The bias of being observed, this was a question that also came up, that, how do I know that it's authentic? It is that you are replicating a natural behavior that this individual has already adopted, which is they may be engaging in a community, or they may be creating content of certain kind, and you're trying to just build on top of that instead of creating a new space and saying, hey, let's synthesize this. So that is not to undermine any of the methods that we use, but it is definitely a value addition that I can give you the space and time to respond to me at your leisure, whether it is a messaging platform or I've gone to a curated platform that I've built a community on as a researcher. It's, like I said, gives you the space to express in a way that you're comfortable with. Language, images, videos, doesn't necessarily have to be even of yourself. It just helps you tell the story. It's like giving tools, but not being in control of them, allowing the participant space to utilize those tools to their advantage. Space and privacy, while of course privacy will have another dimension that we'll touch upon, just the comfort of knowing that I'm not necessarily right now in this space, surrounded, looked at, observed, does definitely make a difference. It is more focused on the individual than the person who is initiating the conversation. So rather than listening to me, you would be listening perhaps to your own voice if this were digital ethnography. And also a creative outlet. I think we also undermine sometimes the extent to which we can elicit creative thinking from an individual that we might be interacting with, because we are tying them down. And this has been a repeated learning we've had, especially what we do in the development sector, where we feel that there will be a certain response and only such responses. But it is important to step away from that bias and realize that there may be creativity that comes through from sharing with pictures and songs and stickers and pretty much any media that the individual is already utilizing. Please take a moment to think of how you use stickers on messaging platforms if you do. And of course, there is flexibility, like I've already mentioned. Coming quickly to some of the practices that we have found work, and this might also cater to the question on depth versus width. Depths usually will come from the manner in which the design is created, in that we usually pick and choose the kinds of questions that we can answer using this method. We know that there will be certain limitations to keep in mind, so you can't go into very long prose. You don't necessarily want to have very long duration of engagement, because digital as a platform is all about short attention spans. So it has to be quick, it has to be pithy, it has to be very on the go, and then you can achieve longitudinal engagement, rather than saying I'm going to spend all day shadowing you, which on digital can become quite taxing. So it's not a questionnaire. That's the first thing we unlearned undertaking digital ethnography, that if I'm going to create a messaging platform and interact with you, it has to be spoken language. In fact, it has to be very much like my friend sending me a message and me responding to it, where it feels like an extension of my everyday.
Spontaneity.
Yes, yes, absolutely. The spontaneity of interaction, as Sharmila pointed out, is something to keep in mind. It helps interact better, and it does take a little bit of unlearning to move away from structured ways of asking questions, because that is all the training that we have. So it is one graph and unlearning, certainly. And the other thing that we've learned is that if we, sorry, just a moment, my screen visible? The other thing that we've learned is that giving instructions, you really cannot give too little of them, because you also have to make peace with the fact that in a digital platform, especially if interaction is coming in or responses are coming in from your participants, they're not going to be spending all day interacting with you. And so they'll probably blink and miss one little message or instruction that may have reached them. So there is definitely a need to keep reiterating. And comfort building needs to happen from the very beginning, which means that the element of this individual who holds together this interaction, whether it is me participating in a close community or it is one-on-one, that role is very, very critical. And it is very dedicated. It is not just something that is done once a day and you step away from it. In a passive setting, of course, it becomes much more about thoroughness and diligence and timeliness and repetition. But again, the longitudinal nature of it does come back into play when we're thinking about width of engagement. And I think time is a very critical lever when it comes to how to achieve width, because you have to keep going back. It can't be a one time, one day, one window exercise.
And you also have to think about how you are going back, because written textual kind of instructions may not work all the time. You are doing digital ethnography. So in all probability, you will also think about how to provide the art, how to provide the introduction. Should it actually be a video of your, which needs to be actually shared with the participants instead of just a, long list of things to do.
Okay. I think coming to, sorry, I was also looking at the questions on the side in case you thought I was dismissing what Sharmila was saying. We're trying to answer them as we go. Before I move on to the next question that we have, sustenance, because it is a longitudinal exercise, you're sort of coming in at various points in time. The onus will be on you to make it engaging, which means things like gamification, and we'll talk about how in just a second. Even interesting language or using humor as a device, something that makes an individual feel like they are in a setting where they would like to share, especially if there is direct interaction involved, is something that can significantly add value. When I say gamification, one of the things that we've learned is that it's not really about the material takeaway. It's more about if there is a time limit for me to answer, if there are points at the end of that time limit. These are small, very unique but very effective tactics that have helped us better interact with individuals when it comes to interacting in a digital setting, and when it's not face to face, where you don't have the opportunity to engage in conversation necessarily. Which brings us to really amping up the mindfulness. But before that, I will take the last question that we had. I think a question that came up for us was, would online communities be a suitable platform for this method, or would a curated, recruited online group be more ideal? I think both approaches can be taken. It really depends on what the subject matter is. If it is something that is more personal, or if it is more individual and non-digital behavior, we tend to find that if we create those groups and then encourage interaction and conversation, much like one would do in focus groups, but in a much more leisurely fashion, then those recruited online groups would be useful. And when you look at communities, I think that is much more about understanding the nuances of cultural phenomena. And by that, I mean interactions taking place. It depends on the subject matter which we want to learn more about. Typically, when you're undertaking studies on larger category trends, that's where that comes into use. So for example, if I'm thinking, say, apparel brands, then the tonality that I would want to understand in terms of interaction, or any particular category within which I want to understand how people are engaging with one another with respect to that particular category or with those brands. I think those are questions, and many more perhaps, where open digital communities come to use, because that's where the trends and the trend bandwagon that individuals are getting on sort of comes into play. And that would be a much more passive role, much like the live example that I had shared earlier. I hope that answers the question. I know we have a couple more, but I think we'll come back to this just after we've wrapped up the ethics part of it, because I do think that this is an important part of the conversation. With all the data that we collect, there is definitely a mindfulness responsibility that comes to the researchers. We'll cover that and very quickly come back to your questions. One of the things to keep in mind is that ethics doesn't just come in when it comes to data privacy. Very definitely a big part of how we need to observe care when and ethical considerations when we are undertaking digital ethnography would be data privacy. But beyond that as well, mindfulness pretty much trickles down across the board. The impersonal nature in that, the virtual nature, can sometimes lead to perception that you don't need to exercise as much care and caution as you would have in a much more intimate setting where you're sitting with a group of people or sitting with an individual or many of those sort of modes of interaction. But it is important to remember that the conversations we are initiating, the language that we use, the kind of time that we take, giving people the space and the freedom to refuse and empowering them with that knowledge, respecting the fact that you're taking up a whole lot of time, all pretty much is a composite of the ethics and the mindfulness that needs to be undertaken. But specifically, there are two aspects to think about. The first, data privacy. There are guidelines that one is expected to adhere to and a code of conduct. However, it is something that requires excessive attention in this case because you may be gathering data that is personal to individuals. We do often have guidelines which state that we don't want you to share identities of individuals, don't maybe share your face if you're sending video content through. But in the public space or in a public digital space, it may not be possible. So protecting that privacy, very much the onus of the researcher, and protecting the researcher as well, because we also make ourselves vulnerable when we volunteer interactions. And that's one part I feel gets left out of the conversation. To protect identity, know that all of the individuals undertaking this digital ethnography are also looking out for their well-being, their safety, their vulnerability and exposure. That of course becomes the organization or the responsibility of the entity that may be undertaking that research. Just before we end today, I think we'll stop and take questions while I leave this on the screen for everyone to.
Yeah, I think so, because you will find that the handy tips actually encompass what we have so far spoken. And there are questions which are coming in which, we would want to give them enough time. So Vaishali Shah has also asked, would online communities be a suitable platform?
I took that question. Go to the next one.
Yeah. Then Vishal Soni has asked, are there any AI tools you have used in the past that have worked well for you while conducting digital ethno? Vishal, that is something, if you actually come across an AI tool, like please, we will be very, very happy to actually learn about those AI tools which can happen in digital ethnography. However, the concept itself is a little, problematic in my mind, because in a ethnography, I am trying to understand the person, and therefore for that person to have the input from, or the direction actually from an AI tool, somehow defeats the purpose of a digital ethnography in my mind. So, but no, we have not used any tool so far. But if you ever come across something interesting, please do share. That will really add to our knowledge. Nandita, you want to take the last question from Richa, because it is one of the fundamental, foundational questions which has always been asked for qualitative research. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I would say, so the question was that in understanding an event, the role of chosen epistemic stances is highly important, because the researcher is also kind of co-constructor of reality. There's no such thing as pure knowledge, as every individual can interpret it differently. So how do you incorporate reflexivity and subjectivity into your approach when you're conducting digital ethnography? And how do these elements influence your interpretation of online interactions? I think I did, and this question probably came in before, but I did touch upon this just briefly in the previous slide, which was to say that it is it's actually 2-3 steps that we've identified, and if you would like to add any inputs to it, great. But we've identified a few steps that help us incorporate this subjectivity and reflexivity, and also set aside bias and acknowledge it upfront when it comes to this particular space, as would be true for research in general. The first, of course, is due diligence beforehand, which is I really want to make sure that if it is a specific subject, then secondary and a quick understanding of what the digital environment looks like with respect to my study topic, that is something that will sort of build your understanding, and you go in with, that's where the hypothesis formation will happen. So if I'm just to take an example and not be very theoretical about it, if I'm thinking of, say, how individuals participate or engage with live content, then I will try and get a sense of academic references, of past work done, of understanding previous work related to media in general before I go into a space and start asking questions. And I think that makes the questions intuitive, and that introduces subjectivity. I feel like that's the biggest contribution the researcher has. And then reflexivity, I think it was the step that Sharmila had talked about, which was to say that you can go back and always revisit. It doesn't have to end there and then, also because it's a relatively easier medium to engage with. And so you have that freedom. You have the ability to check again, to undertake a longer duration of data collection or observation or interaction as part of the method. I hope that answers the question. And I think there's one final question that we have.
Vishal is clarifying that I meant for analysis of data collected or for data collection. Yes, Vishal, since digital ethnography is going to have a lot of visuals and videos and everything, I have not experienced it. I don't think Nandita has experienced it also so far. But I heard that Atlas TI's latest version is very good in terms of helping you analyze the visual kind of a content that you have received. So that was it. And yes, Professor Ashutosh Pandey, thanks for being here, Professor. So lovely to actually have you with us. You have asked which philosophical underpinning do we follow for digital ethnography. Now, if I go back to Gold's, philosophy of researcher being an observer to researcher being a participant, then on that observer participant is probably the closest that digital ethnography has, because the other two, which are participant and observer, become difficult in a digital ethnography project, because your chances of putting or introducing biases become greater in the entire exercise. So Nandita, you want to add something?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. And perhaps the deepest question I've ever been asked about digital ethnography. So thank you so much for that.
So that actually brings us to the end of our session, leaving behind some caveats also, because yes, we can do a lot with digital ethnography, but there are certain things which we need to be, again, mindful of. And that's it. So,
absolutely.
Over to you, Diana.
Yes, just before I do the closure, Ashutosh Pandey saying a big thank you, Sharmila, and a big thank you for our incredible speakers, Sharmila and Nandita, for sharing your expertise and valuable insights with us today. Looking at the questions we have received, it's clear that the topic sparked some curiosity. And we also want to thank all of you in the audience for your active participation and questions received. So again, once again, thank you for a fantastic session. And we look forward to many more engaging discussions in the future. If with this, we'll have to close. It's 6:00 p.m. for us in India, and have a great day ahead. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.